Thanks for logging on to WPRI.com. I'm Eyewitness News reporter Ted Nesi, and I'm here with my friend and Target 12 investigator Tim White. We have major news today about a huge mob bust across the Northeast, including the former boss, reputed, of the New England Mafia. Tim, could you put this in perspective for us, first of all?
Well, as I've been saying all day today, it's really hard to underestimate how big a bust today's mob sweep is. I've essentially been waiting for this day since we started reporting on the federal investigation into the reputed former head of the patriarch of crime family, Luigi Baby Shax Minacchio, back in 2009. We had started reporting on his connections to getting protection payments from strip clubs in Providence, and we've been hearing about grand jury testimonies and whatnot, and periodically checking in on the case. And then, of course, yesterday we learned of the arrest.
So Minacchio, he was picked up, looking at our story here, in Fort Lauderdale. He's 83 years old now.
Right.
Who is this guy? Tell us about him.
Yeah, he's longtime figure in New England LCN. He became the boss in the 90s. He picked up where Francis Cadillac Frank Salemi left off meaning he was arrested and charged by the federal government. So the leadership moved back to Rhode Island, and Minacchio has run a pretty tight ship, if you will. He stayed off the law enforcement radar screen except for a minor scrape in the mid to late 90s. He was the reputed boss up until at least 2006. Now, we reported in 2009, we first reported that he handed the reins over to another boss, and that's because, as you point out, I mean, he's not a young man, and this is not a young man's game, and he was also feeling the heat from the feds in an investigation.
Although healthier than a lot of the bosses.
Yes, he's an active runner. He is an avid skier. He's in his early 80s, but I say he looks a lot younger than that.
So let's talk about the nickname. People always, we get emails about this.
Yeah.
Luigi Baby Shax Minacchio is what we're saying today, and some people say Shanks, but you're hearing it's definitely Shax.
Yeah, well, it has gone back and forth, and I've talked to people in law enforcement and in the wise guy community, if you will, and there's confusion even among them as to whether it's Shax or Shanks. And I got to tell you, when we do these stories, I get tons of emails just on that. Are you sure you have it right? We go with Baby Shax because that's what the federal government goes with. And if you read the indictment, which is on our website, WPRI.com, you will see that it says Luigi Minacchio, and then it lists his nicknames: Louie, Baby Shax, the Professor, and the Old Man. So those are the nicknames we go with.
So it's awkward to ask the boss which nickname he prefers.
Yeah, you usually don't go down that road.
Why Shax, though?
Well, there's theories as to why Shax and theories as to why Shanks. Shax was that he was a bit of a ladies' man, in slang for shacking up, if you will, and Shanks was a small knife.
Okay. So have you ever met him? I know you've run into a lot of these people over these. Have you ever met Minacchio?
I have. Several years ago, Federal Hill, fairly accessible guy, actually, and this being my beat, I try and reach out to the other side. I mean, I think it's only fair. They never want to comment. Obviously, they don't even acknowledge that La Cosa Nostra exists until St. Laurent did it recently, which is a big admission. But yeah, I ran into Federal Hill. He knew who I was. I knew, obviously, who he was. We had a really nice chat. It had no substance in the context of what we're talking about.
What was he like? Was he intimidating? Was he friendly?
I think he's intimidating just because of who he is. Mm-hmm. He's a healthy guy, a health nut, but he's not massive in stature. He's an old man. But he's very respectful. He was a gentleman, and he knows Rhode Island, knows everyone in Rhode Island, and we had a good talk about that, and that was pretty much the end of it. But he was a nice guy.
So picking up...
the feds don't think he is.
The feds don't like him. That came through in the indictment today.
That's right.
So how big a deal is it to pick up a boss, or perhaps at this point a former boss who's passed on? How big a deal is that for the feds?
Let's put it this way.
Because he's been arrested before.
He has been arrested before, and he was recently identified as the reputed boss. But there are 5 families in New York, and it was a big deal when they wiped out the leadership of the 5 families in New York. The FBI's organized crime radar then shifted to New England, and here's why. The FBI agent, the head of the organized crime task force for the FBI in New England, told me, he said, look, for this region, La Cosa Nostra is still our number one threat assessment with organized crime. Not Asian gangs, not Latin gangs you hear elsewhere, not like the Russian gangs in Cleveland, Ohio, the Mexican. It's LCN, and the only active boss left on the street at the time when I interviewed Jeff Sellette is his name several years ago. The only active boss left on the street in this country was Louis Minacchio.
So it's a big deal to get him.
Big deal to take him down.
But he's not, we don't think, in charge anymore day to day. He's not the boss at this point. Is that correct?
Yeah, our law enforcement sources told us, and we were the first to report in 2009, that the power shifted back to Boston. Remember we talked about Salemi earlier, and he had the power. It's now in the hands of, according to law enforcement sources, a guy by the name of Peter Lamoni, who was wrongfully imprisoned for 30 years in a famous case involving a corrupt FBI agent. He came out and was identified as a consigliere or advisor to the family, and then stepped up to the big role recently. The federal government has not officially acknowledged this, but it's telling that in the indictment that was unsealed today, they do acknowledge, and Eric Holder acknowledged it in the press conference, Minacchio's the former boss.
Now, I know you once said to me that the transition of power in the mob is not like an election. It's not one day, all right, he's out and somebody else is in. How was it a clean handoff from Minacchio to who we think is the new guy here?
I think that remains to be seen.
Okay.
These things can be really messy. They've, in the past, traditionally gotten violent and have come with a power struggle. So far, we haven't heard of any of that, and there isn't any disputes. I think one thing to keep in mind is the reputed underboss, according to law enforcement sources, is a Providence guy, Robert Bobby DeLuca, and he spent a lot of time in prison with the Boston faction of LCN. So you have strong ties there between these two men, and there's undercover video of them having dinner up in Boston after the funeral of a big-time mobster up there. So I think that while I would categorize New England's LCN as fractured or splintered right now, I don't think we're going to see a lot of people racing to the top, because when you do that, you're on the FBI's radar screen quick.
That leads to my next question, which is the one I think you get the most, which is how powerful is the mafia today in New England? We know how it was in the 70s and into the 80s, but in 2011, how powerful is organized crime in La Cosa Nostra?
Depends who you talk to. Now, law enforcement people I've talked to here, vets, will say that it is a shell of what it once was, particularly in New England, that it really operated as a secondary government in the 70s and 80s. They had cops in their pocket. They had judges in their pocket. And you don't see that as much anymore. I think you do a little bit more in New York, but at the press conference with Eric Holder, they wanted to make it perfectly clear that's a myth, that they're still operating around here, around the country. Locally in New England, I think why Minacchio has been able to stay off the federal radar screen, talking to law enforcement, he hasn't done anything to draw a lot of attention to himself. They do a lot of illegal sports gambling. We hear about those busts from time to time. They do a lot of loan sharking.
The strip clubs.
Well, strip clubs, the protection payments in this indictment, which do come with 23 years of conspiracy and the extortion, it's a big deal. But it's not drug dealing. Once you start moving, cocaine or something like that, suddenly you've got a big headache. And the last big bust we had in that was a guy named Matthew Guglielmetti, a Providence capo regime. He was accused of moving cocaine, and he's doing a lot of time in prison. So some in the law enforcement community credit, for lack of a better word, Minacchio for keeping a tight ship.
I remember former Projo columnist Charlie Bass mentioned to me recently that in the 70s, Rhode Island introduced the lottery partly to compete with the mob. That's how powerful they were at that point in time.
Yeah, well, I think the thinking was, if the mob's going to make money, why can't we?
Now, we should say Minacchio, he's the big fish here, but someone else was picked up. Thomas Iafredi of Johnston was arrested this morning at his home by FBI agents. Who's he? How does he fit in?
Thomas Iafredi, according to the indictment, is a worker at the Cadillac Lounge in the Satin Doll. The accusation is that Minacchio was accepting protection payments from these strip clubs. Iafredi was a treasurer of sorts, or a bookkeeper, I should say, and was the conduit of the handoff. In 2009, we reported that two FBI agents approached Minacchio in a restaurant he has an interest in Federal Hill, and they found an envelope with marked bills on him, and these bills traced back to the Cadillac Lounge. He was with the courier at the time when the FBI agents approached him. I'd be curious to know if that was Thomas Iafrate at the time. We'll probably learn that as this unfolds.
We've been kind of on warp speed.
And I should say, I'm sorry, he's not a made member of the Patriarch of Crime family. To our knowledge, they refer to him as a mob associate.
And that, I fully admit, I'm not. What's the difference? How big a deal is that?
Yeah, well, there's a big difference in that world that a made member is a button man, if you will. You're inducted into the organized crime family. An associate is someone who is obviously associated with organized crime. They help the operation make money, and they make money themselves.
Can you get promoted from an associate to made member? Is that the idea?
Sure. That was for a long time the goal, and you literally had to kill to do it.
Yeah. And I was going to say that we've been on warp speed with Mafia news the last 48 hours or so. We had Anthony the Saint Laurent just yesterday.
Yeah.
He said he'd plead guilty. Do you think that was all connected?
Well, officially, the U.S. Attorney's Office says that remains to be seen. They're not linking it. But I think what's really telling, read the plea agreement on our website, and I'll just tell people now, go to the last 2 pages. It's called The Finding of Facts. First paragraph in that, federal prosecutors were able to get St. Laurent to admit that he's a made member of the Patriarch of Crime family. Ted, this is extremely rare. That's a big deal. But more importantly, he identified, sorry, we just have a lot going on.
A man in demand.
Yeah, more importantly, they were able to identify, he was willing to identify Menacchio as the boss, at least in 2006. They don't do things by accident. These are complicated cases. Certainly that's not the one thing, but I don't think it's coincidental that is unsealed, and then later that day, Menacchio is arrested in Florida. It certainly doesn't hurt prosecutors to have a notorious, well-known mobster say, that guy's the boss, or was.
Well, I know we'll all be turning to you, and you'll be following this closely as time goes on. Here with Target 12 investigator Tim White, I'm Eyewitness News reporter Ted Nesi. Thanks for logging on to WPRI.com.